All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the current installment of Academia SG's Junior Scholar Seminar. We're really happy today to invite Evio to talk to us about what actually seems a little bit paradoxical, how the sort of welfarist CPF scheme is actually promoting capitalism and neoliberal attitudes towards the economy, which is I think something that's pretty fascinating, this sort of inversion of what might otherwise be seen as quite a socialist or at least social welfarist kind of a approach to managing retirement and things like that. So at any rate, this event is not about me, it's about Eve, who just submitted her thesis. So we're really excited about that. And what we'll do is Eve will present for about half an hour or so, and we're also very honored. I'm very honored to have my friend Karen Lai here to discuss, and Karen will provide her comments for about 5 or so minutes, and then we'll open for more general discussion. You can leave your questions in the comments, or let me know if you'd like to raise anything, and we'll go on for about an hour or so, and that's essentially the rundown. Okay, I'm not going to take up any more of your time. Eve, please take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. So thanks for coming and sharing this evening or afternoon if you're in the UK with me. I'm just going to very quickly share my screen over here. So can everyone see my screen? Yeah, okay. So this project kind of started with an interest to sort of understand how people kind of organize themselves around the economy, referring to how people think and talk about this notion of the economy and why it seems so embedded in Singaporean life. So the work that I'm talking about today has been developed with one of my supervisors, Joe Greener. We have been working on a more critical approach to understanding social policy in Singapore, particularly the CPF, as kind of a way to conceptualize the force of state power in organizing social life in Singapore. So we have actually published a paper prior in Global Social Policy that sort of looked at how CPF functions as a class project to produce and protect the labor market and the traditional family model. We also have a forthcoming paper in Social Policy Review that sort of looks at CPF as a tool in the mediation of capitalist logic. So our work really seeks to critique CPF as something that has become so naturalized within Singaporean lives. So in today's presentation, I am really focused on CPF as a form of state power. I really want to implicate this welfare tool in the reproduction of specific economic practices and the prevailing social order. So I utilize the cultural political economy as my theoretical framework. The cultural political economy is basically a way of understanding the reproduction of capitalism. It takes seriously the role of sense and meaning making to really consider the constitution of social reality. This approach was developed by Sam Nai-Ling and Bob Jessup. They argue that the real world is actually really too complex to be grasped in real time. So people engage in complexity reduction, which is basically an act to simplify the kind of complex and chaotic and messy reality into more manageable and coherent structures. So they use this term imaginary to kind of refer to an entry point into the real world. So for example, the economy, as we often refer to, is actually kind of an imaginary that really simplifies a complicated world. So through the economy, we can refer to multitudes of economic activities and processes. It kind of helps us to understand economic aspects of the real world. So the issue with complexity reduction, right, is that it's not neutral. There are some meanings and actions that's more prominent than others, and there are some social processes and relations that's more easily achieved than others, because there are external forces that's at play that often guides or influences some practices and meanings over other. So this kind of embeddedness of certain imaginaries can result in the very, I guess, consistent reproduction of specific economic relations and processes. For example, when we think about wage labor, as well as gendered roles within the nuclear family. So external forces can include IMF, mass communications, think tanks. These kind of forces really seek to embed some practices over others. For example, we have the measurements of good governance by the UN to kind of prioritize technocratic approaches to government, or the structural adjustment programs to expand trade markets. So dominant imaginaries really come and inform our norms and our way of life, so they become a part of our common sense. such normalized aspects of economic imaginaries, like the need for constant economic development or the differentiation between citizens and non-citizens, they're actually part of how capitalist logics they come to be reproduced. So I utilize CPF here today as an entry point to kind of understand economic and social processes within everyday life in Singapore. But this is, I have to highlight that this is a state-led imaginary, right? So in making this point, I'm sort of talking about the role of state power in the structuring of everyday life to reproduce capitalism. So neoliberalism here is a big term, but I use it to kind of refer to the current economic conjuncture where economics and perhaps more accurately capitalism has been depoliticized. So scholars is kind of characterize it as a global order that connects markets and society, and it's a force that carries both symbolic and material dimensions. Wendy Brown describes this kind of transformation of state-society relations that is really guided as a markets and moral project where morality was marketized and markets were moralized. So we have this economic framework here where ethics and goodness was sort of deemed to be achievable by free market, and where the free market has sort of become this moral good that has to be protected. And economics became much more about morality than about politics. As a global project, right, neoliberalism is actually economics that's encased from politics, right? The economy is now so important and dominant that politics is deemed as an interference. But this is of course not true, right? Within a political economy, economics and politics are intricately intertwined. They may seem separate, but they are not. So the logics of capitalism actually took on new forms under neoliberalism. So for example, like the developmental logic of the growth paradigm has kind of led to this elevation of the economy, right? That the economy has become something that's really important for the progress and development of modern society. So state processes really kind of facilitated the creation of a kind of political arithmetic to enable the governing and assessment of the economy, which really legitimated and justified inequality while maintaining a kind of social order, right? A capitalist social order for the functioning of global markets. So you can think of statistics, measurements like GDP and things like that. But I'm really trying to highlight neoliberalism as a kind of epistemic force, as a kind of way of how we understand our way of life, how we understand the things around us, how we understand the social world. I think Foucauldian scholars are quite useful in conceptualizing the relationship between knowledge production, governance, and subject formation under neoliberalism. Nicholas Rose, he argues, for example, that neoliberalism sought to govern the soul, and state power and other external forces really work to organize human conduct so that subjects can become more marketizable, where they are responsibilized to shape their own lives through, conscious choice making about their future and their own, kind of market potential. And a really good way, I think, to think about this is financialization. So by financialization, I kind of refer to the increasing role of financial motives, financial markets, financial actors, and financial institutions across the global economy. This really kind of highlights the growing elevation of and power of finance in governance and operation of the economy. So financialization has been kind of directing the restructuring of the global economy since the 1970s. It has today become one of the defining features of modern economic life. We can see this through the important role of interest-bearing capital, right? So this is like finance. There's this kind of multiplier effect, where capital grows capital, money grows money, right? This focus on the immense pursuit of financial returns rather than on increasing real productivity that kind of increases wages and perhaps develop the overall health of the economy. So there are definitely bigger problems with financialization as a whole, particularly its kind of promise of returns by borrowing from the future. Financialization is largely driven by speculation. It is an illusion of growth and development, right? But I am focused on financialization as subject formation today. So I won't go too deep into why financialization is particularly dangerous for our society. But I must note that a lot of economists and sociologists, scholars like John Kay and Andrew Sayer, they have written about financialization and how destructive it can be. Particularly in terms of how finance extracts value and contributes to absolutely disgraceful levels of inequality in the world. So finance is a neoliberal system of accumulation that's driven by finance, right? Interest-bearing capital. It is articulated through the power of the state to impose and drive this kind of internationalization of finance in different territories. So what I mean by this is that financialization, it doesn't occur uniformly across the world. The financialization that's happening in the US and in the UK is quite different from the financialization in Singapore. So ultimately, I want to stress though that financialization is a state-driven process, right? It doesn't just occur through the dictates of free market. So oftentimes I think governments in Singapore especially, right, our ministers would often describe financial forces of neoliberalism or globalization, as they would describe it, they will talk about this force as kind of inevitable, or a consequence of Singapore being a small and open economy. But financialization cannot occur without the state actually imposing the architecture for finance capital to flow through. So we can definitely see this in Singapore through how our economic and social policies kind of dictated to promote economic markets, especially that of finance. So we have to recognize the state as a force within financialization. So a key social transformation under financialization is basically a changing relation to the economy, because we are now more and more concerned about the economy. We are more and more concerned because financialization socializes financial risk into our day-to-day life. Right? We can think about the risks that we take in terms of floating interest rates for our mortgages, buying into different wealth building schemes through financial planners. For Randy Martin, he wrote a really good book, The Financialization of Daily Life, right? Financialization for him was not really just a process through which finance came to dominate society. It was also a site where there's new logics of economic rationality and practices. So across the world, as the rise of private pension portfolio increases, financialization has also increased. So welfare security is now tied to our labor, right, via financialization. So speculative financial processes kind of extend capital into a feature of the lived experience rather than just a condition of labor. So what I mean by that is that we are no longer just thinking about our wages and our economic productivity. We are more thinking about our economic value as a whole. So as subject learns to measure themselves through economic fundamentals in terms of interest-bearing capital, like, how much savings do I have? How much interest does my bank give me? Or, the entrepreneurial investing self, like, what's my financial portfolio worth? How can I maximize my financial assets, right? Subjects learn to internalize financialization as a way of being, right? So we can no longer just treat financialization as a kind of economic process, because it's come to form part and parcel of daily lives. So it's a part of our subjectivity as well. Individuals take on greater financial responsibilities and risk through, personal pension, or mortgages, private insurance, and investments. So financialization is not just only a financial process; it's also one that's of subject formation. So as economic fundamentals become principles of a new social contract, where despite not having significant capital, people are being asked to think like capitalists, right? So this kind of processes actually blurs the boundaries between capital and labor. Because of the breakdown in the subject's awareness of their positionality, right? They are no longer just a worker, no longer just an employee. They are also an investor. They are also a financial consumer. So financialization then leads to this kind of acceptance and internalization of financial risk as part of the everyday life. So in this sense, right, financialization kind of activates the entrepreneurial and financialized self, because this is how subjects learn to manage their financial risk in their lives. So when subjects think of maximizing their financial portfolio, when they think of earning passive income, subjects come to collaborate and become aligned with financial capital and economies, which really obscure state power in financialization, because personal finance encourage allegiance to financial economies and economic development, right? The economy needs to do well for me to do well, for me to earn money. So the proliferation of financial accounting and risk management into daily life not only leads to this kind of disintegration of class consciousness through a focus of individual wealth and asset accumulation, it also really depoliticizes economic processes as subjects come to become embedded into the economy and more aligned to capitalist processes of accumulation. So I've just gone through three big concepts, but I just want to give like a key takeaway so far. Right, when I'm talking about CP, I'm really focused on how logics, sense, and meaning making actually reproduce capitalism through an imaginary. And I'm looking at the Central Provident Fund, the welfare apparatus of Singapore, as an imaginary to reproduce capitalism. And in talking about neoliberalism, I really kind of focus on how capitalism has kind of become depoliticized because the economy is so elevated, it's become so important, right? And with financialization, it sort of addresses how we become more and more concerned with the well-being and the health of the economy. So just some brief context about financialization in Singapore. So in Singapore, financialization is arguably universal among the citizenry. So through the Central Provident Fund, CPF, which is a key welfare apparatus, CPF is a forced savings scheme that automatically deducts a percentage of the workers' wages monthly to form their pension savings. Employers and CPF boards supplement a percentage monthly as well. So funds in the CPF are interest-bearing, right? So this is financialized capital. They are matched by the CPF board. So Singapore does have a very high rate of national savings that have historically been funded funded the national reserve and our annual budgets. So banking and finance actually became key economic strategies of the Singapore state post 1985 recession and continuing, following the Asian financial crisis. But the state sought to, centralize capital through their banking system, and they responded to international trends in global and finance markets since the 1980s. So they were really trying to financialize Singapore's, internationalize Singapore's finance market. Last year, the finance and insurance sector was worth around 13% of Singapore's GDP. So the finance sector is actually really big and important for Singapore. And of importance within financialization in Singapore is our sovereign wealth funds, right, which is kind of a key way of how the Singapore government grows and manages its assets. I think we have one of the wealthiest sovereign wealth funds in the world when we combine the assets of GIC and Temasek Holdings. So national savings from CPF were initially managed by the Monetary Authority of Singapore, so MAS, up until 1980s. Our first finance minister, Goh Keng Swee, right, he recognized the potential of the national savings in providing large annual surpluses. But because the investment decisions made by MAS in the 1980s were too conservative for Singapore's development, then the Government of Singapore Investment Corporation, that is the GIC, was set up to pursue investment interests abroad to kind of garner greater profits for Singapore's reserves and expenditure. So it started with about 2 million in 1981, but as GIC is managing now an estimated USD $690 billion worth of assets in 2022. So portions of the profit from our sovereign wealth funds actually goes into the country's annual budget, some of which are used to match the interest rates that are promised through the CPF accounts. So just to be clear though, the national savings that are used, right, they aren't actually directly sourced from CPF. They are invested through special Singapore government securities, which is a sort of guaranteed bonds that are guaranteed by the government. So according to them, this assures that CPF savings are safe regardless of financial market conditions. But ultimately, the utilization of CPF monies within GIC actually enmeshes welfare to financialization, which ultimately means that finance is embedded into aspects of all social life. Arguably, this orientates the state to privilege, economic strategies that fuel financial growth. So pension savings, in this sense, they constitute the largest and most of the long-term processes of financialization in any economy. And given the degree of financialization of pensions in Singapore, then it's unsurprising that a lot of norms and practices would accommodate and even encourage, as I will show later on, active financial market participation. So in this sense, right, state-driven processes have really impacted economic life and financial practices in Singapore. And I'll show this as I discuss the policy implication of CPF. So how does the CPF work? I'm just going to give a very brief introduction here. Right? So every month, depending on your age, if you're like me, 55 years and below, so roughly about 20% of your salary will be deducted automatically and placed into your CPF account. Your employer will also match your salary roughly about 17% to go into the CPF accounts. Of all that, 37%, they all go into different accounts within the CPF. So your CPF actually has 3 separate accounts, right? There is the ordinary account, there is the MediSave account, and there is the special account. So money that's placed into CPF accounts, they are interest bearing, and depending on which account the money goes in, they earn different amounts of interest. The interests, are matched by the government. So there are 3 key contributors to CPF, right? Which is also, interestingly, the 3 keys that's represented in the CPF logo: the account holder themselves, the employer, and the government. So CPF was actually designed as a private pension fund. This is the CPF is, I think I have to highlight that it's only available for citizens and Singapore permanent residents. So because it was initially designed as a pension fund, so withdrawals from the fund were initially only allowed to be made after an individual turned 55 years old. But I think to describe CPF as a pension fund is an oversimplification. So it is stressed in government communications that kind of like CPF is meant primarily to be a welfare scheme, but it's really quite a massive welfare tool, right? There are protections that are set in place to ensure that subjects do not overutilize funds, so that when they buy into a government regulated risk pooling scheme, which is the CPF Life, to ensure, so that they have cash to ensure they can buy into it. Sorry, they have cash to buy into this CPF Life, which can provide lifelong cash handout when they reach age 65. But really, CPF is kind of also used to fund housing, healthcare, and even education needs, right? Because funds in the ordinary account can be used to fund their housing purchases, investment schemes, and education. Funds in your medical account is used to support hospitalization and selected health insurance. Funds in the special account then is basically used for retirement purposes, but it can also be invested with CPF investment schemes. So of interest here, I think, is basically the introduction of this investment scheme, which was introduced in 1986, which allows individuals to invest funds in their ordinary account or in their special account to optimize their retirement funds. To invest through CPFIS, an individual must have more than $20,000 in the ordinary account and or more than $40,000 in their special account. So there are strict measures in place that ensure not all of the money in CPF can be used in investments, which kind of points to particular eligibilities, right? That only individuals with a certain amount of wealth are able to optimize their retirement, but it also highlights the government's awareness of the risk that's involved in financial investments. So the goal of CPF is ultimately to ensure that the account holders meet their retirement sum to buy into CPF Life. There are different retirement sums that are suggested. So in 2023, the prevailing basic retirement sum, the lowest sum, is actually around $99,000, which will give out roughly $800 per month every month. So CPF is ultimately a very individualized system of conditional welfare provision because it relies mainly on an individual's access to consistent gainful employment, because the fund that's accrued depends entirely on an individual's employment status and financial productivity. So funds in the CPF are also not accessible to support an individual if they become unemployed or face financial difficulties. So in that sense, there are a lot of regulations that's in place to kind of reflect CPF tendency to discipline subjects into very specific forms of employment and encourage financial literacy to grow their assets and be financially prudent through the various kind of choices, right, through different retirement sums that's offered. But there are very specific conditions that's in place for the deployment of CPF money. So you can only use CPF money in very specific conditions. These conditions are also then embedded in terms of how logics and the narratives of CPF is sort of depicted through government communications. So the policy is designed this way to highlight personal responsibility, right? The ownership and the facilitation of a lifelong income. So officially, CPF represents the state approach to social policy. This is reflected on the CPF website, right, where it states that Singapore social policy embody the national philosophy of active government support for citizen self-reliance. So this is geared towards promoting responsibility and activation, right? In that sense, the responsibility of welfare is carried by the individual CPF account holder. So I have here this image over here, which is the egg, the multiple egg, right? I got this from one of the slides in a CPF seminar that I actually attended. I really like it. I think it's this kind of metaphor of a CPF nest egg and the multiplying effect of compound interest that kind of grows your money. So, it points to this fact, right, that CPF is primarily a nest egg for retirement. It grows with the power of compound interest. So subjects are really kind of encouraged to also make tax-free cash top-ups for themselves and their loved one to grow savings. Across brochures, websites, videos, right, the benefit of work is also really stressed, that workers should stay employed to build their nest egg. So there's a certain rhetoric of choice and responsibility that surrounds the CPF, right? The individual is responsible for the retirement of their choice. You work more, you have to work for longer, be prudent, buy only housing that you can afford, plan for a retirement sum that meets your needs. So there's all these narratives of kind of pro-work values and financial prudence that gets subjects to start thinking about saving early, starting as soon as possible, and working so that they can make the most of their CPF. So CPF encompassing nature really kind of enables a discourse that normalizes a view of this kind of aspirational life that has a universal potential, right? That anyone could achieve a good life as long as they, consume meaningfully, they work and they make good behavioral choices, right? But in reality, the working of CPF really seeks to guide subject behavior into a desired mold of Singaporean citizenship, right? That of economic productivity, employment, labor activation, and financial smartness, right? There's this discourse of CPF that focuses on ownership, that CPF is your money, your pension. The state does not actually own any part of it. But the reality is still one where the state is in control of our money, right? That we cannot really withdraw the money until a certain age. And even then, we still have to buy into a very specific financial program that is state designed. So there may be options or choices that's presented through different retirement sums or cash payout plans. But these kind of choices are illusory. It's not so much a choice, and it is enforced regulations to everyday living in Singapore. So these restrictions ultimately underscores the decisions that we as Singaporeans have to make in terms of planning for our best retirement, right? The few choices that can be made are designed by the policy mechanism, and a good retirement seems to only be affordable to those who have the financial means. So CPF tasks work in very regulatory ways, right? They privilege and align with certain choices to reflect what a responsible citizen subject should act and look like. And subjects are increasingly taking on the role of the investor and the consumer because our lifestyles are increasingly financialized. So in Singapore, the meanings and practices of financialization is more or less enforced by way of the compulsory CPF scheme, right? So CPF informs how we think about the economy and how we understand our economic and financial life, relating to employment and financial risk. Subjects themselves, they are attuned to becoming, smart financial and employed consumers who should be in charge of their own wealth via various programs and schemes that encourage financial prudence and future planning. So all in all, I think CPF is a really complex system that requires effort and time to understand. The complexity that's regarding the workings of CPF requires that a lot of Singaporeans, or majority of Singaporeans, to have a certain amount of financial literacy to not just maximize their retirement savings, but also to utilize it for their healthcare and housings. So in a very individualized capacity, CPF account holders, they're encouraged to act like investors, right? Be smart, start soon. So CPF thus functions to kind of encourage and sometimes even enforcing, in cases where individuals require social support assistance, labor market entry. For a majority of the population, right, a job will be how they gain access to welfare eligibilities. So CPFIS even grooms the investor subject. So this is from Caroline's paper, right? She was reflecting on the mini bond crisis in 2008. She argued that CPFIS was really important about transforming ideas on saving and investing, and it really kind of fueled the growth of financial planning services that was offered by retail banks. There are now stricter regulations in place after the financial crisis of 2008 to protect CPF savings. So when account holders do decide to invest, but the onus is kind of still on investors to kind of remain self-reliant and informed about the financial markets. So the individualizing nature here of CPF, right, I think I would argue really works to depoliticize capitalist processes of production as a part of everyday life, right? When we think about wage labor, when we think about financialization, we don't think of them as capitalistic processes, but they are. So CPF is therefore a kind of like a regulatory as well as an epistemic force in organizing Singaporean life. Its processes generate a kind of like subjectivity that is more aligned with asset and wealth accumulation, so that we can facilitate a kind of good life that supports housing, retirement, and healthcare. So in this sense, CPF depoliticizes what should be in reality highly political practices, right? When we are thinking about welfare rights and welfare entitlement, welfare eligibilities. So welfare access via CPF kind of reflects how commodified welfare remains in Singapore, right? Particularly since subjects, they are not emancipated from labor market dependency, right? We are still dependent on a job for our welfare or for welfare benefits. So in this case, CPF actually really routinizes and automates financialization and, the economic system, because through routinization and being automated, CPF have become such a naturalized system. And this kind of routinization depoliticizes state power in the structuring and organizing of neoliberal capitalism. CPF reproduces economic processes that's required for capitalism, right? It creates the labor force and it encourages financial capital. So CPF really enables subjects to understand certain aspects of the complex economy by yielding this kind of subjectivity as a means for which subjects define themselves through measures of finance, right? Our being, our value is kind of determined by how much money we have and how much money we can make. So Imogen Tyler, she argues that because of financialization, people no longer recognize themselves as existing as a social class, but more individually, especially because I think social inequality today has become so individualized. So in that sense, right, financialization actually decomposes class awareness. This kind of restricts alternative imaginings of political possibilities, right? And I think that this can be reflected by one of a statement that was in Traubinghoff's book, Disavowing Liberalism, where he argues that state processes in Singapore has actually kind of produced a political conservatism that is protective, very protective of the hard-earned material gain that is aligned with the government's emphasis on the need to maintain social and political stability. So to conclude, right, the CPF constitute and produce the dominant economic imaginary that kind of embeds financialization as a way of life by seeking to produce the kind of self-reliant, responsibilized financial subject through policy regulations. So the financialization of welfare really kind of strengthened the neoliberal social order because subjects are more aligned to asset accumulation and pro-wealth behavior. So subjects come to collaborate with financial capital. They are aligned with, kind of attaining wealth. So it really obscures state power in financialization because personal finance really encouraged allegiance to financial economies and economic development. So the proliferation of finance and risk into everyday life, it really depoliticizes this kind of economic processes or capitalist processes, because subjects are embedded to the economy, right? They sort of become like a part of the economy and become more aligned to capitalistic processes of accumulation. So I think in this way, CPF really restricts alternative imaginings of social redistribution. Once we're embedded into the economy, we tend to think of everything in very economic terms, right? And when we think in economic terms, I think it becomes very difficult to challenge our norms around things like minimum wage or universal welfare rights, because these things become treated as expensive problems rather than being conceptualized as a way to encourage flourishing of human capacity. So to end this, I want to stress that we should politicize financialization. We should really politicize CPF. CPF have to be critiqued as a tool that reproduces neoliberal capitalism, and we need to repoliticize CPF practices so that we are able to have alternative welfare possibilities. So yeah, these are my references, and thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Eve. Karen?
Thank you very much, Eve. That's almost like a tour de force, overview of your dissertation. Thank you for highlighting the ways in which state and financialization are really very much entrenched and enmeshed, more so than has been recognized in the financialization literature until I think quite recently. So when you pick up on the work of people like Randy Martin and some of the others who were starting to write about the financialization of individual subjects, right, of how people, the ordinary person like you and I, who become more and more embedded and entrenched in ways of thinking that are aligned to certain financial logics. Our futures are tied in together with the futures of financial markets and how things are doing on financial markets. It was always framed as a highly individualized choice and very driven by the neoliberal market and market imperatives. I think it's only in kind of the last 5 to 8 years or so that more and more scholars were starting to engage with and work with how financialization of individual subjects are actually very much molded and also mobilized by state actors and state apparatus, right, in order to achieve particular kinds of goals. And I thought you brought that out, really clearly in the work that you were doing. And I think some of that makes me think of some of the earlier work which I think you did mention as well, that I was trying to work at a few years ago, looking at the ways in which individual investors in Singapore were being called, right, to become that we're being called to be investors. It's no longer enough to save. So I remember in one of the earlier papers the project that I was working on with an undergraduate student of mine, actually, where we looked at the Post Office Savings Bank, POSB in Singapore, where its raison d'etre, right, was as a savings instrument, right, to encourage people to save, right. I think some of us who are a little bit more advanced in age may remember buying savings stamps in our primary school to put in our savings passbook, because that was the kind of subjecthood, right, that we were being told to emulate and to develop. Save for a rainy day and so on. But that really started to shift in the 90s and in the 2000s into investments. Right? We're all later called not just to be savers, but also to be investors, because that is the responsible way, that is the rational way in order to plan and provide for your own financial future, but also for your family, right? For financial planning for your family's future. So that distinctive shift is very much aligned, and that was what I was arguing in that project, and I think you were doing it really well in your presentation as well. That this kind of shift in financial subjectivity is not about a neoliberal market alignment, but it is very much molded through state apparatus, state policies that started to nudge people, right, to move in a certain direction, such that in my instance, I call it financial citizenship. That it calls up, that with the framing of citizenship, it's about you have certain rights as a citizen, but you also have certain duties and obligation, right? So you have the rights to be, to travel with a Singapore passport, rights to certain access to, particular public resources, but you have certain obligations as well, right? Obligations in terms of paying your taxes, serving national service, and things like that. And so similarly, right, in thinking about the increasing access, right, of individuals to a greater range of financial products, being able to benefit from the prosperity as well as a growing array of options, right, for investments and financial planning. There are also certain obligations, and the obligation is that we have to be increasingly responsible. We have to be increasingly entrepreneurial. We have to be risk-taking. And we can see all that starting to come through as well in CPF. So as a very specific kind of institution, right, that you really delve into very richly, we can see the ways in which the individual financial subject as being responsible, as being risk-taking to a certain extent, because how much risk you can take is also highly prescribed, right, in those very specific categories of the different accounts and so on. So it's a really interesting way of thinking about how we are being called to be certain kinds of financial subjects, but also within certain kinds of limitations and framings, which are highly prescribed, right, by the state in this case. So I thought that was also drawn out in really interesting ways. Just one more thing I want to maybe mention before I think we open up to question as well, is kind of the moral dimension of this, which you did point out in your presentation. So you did highlight, for instance, right, that it is about how what we can use the CPF for, right, is highly regulated, and you can only use it for approved usage. So these approved usage relates to things like using it for public housing, right, to pay for public housing, for tertiary education, especially for children, for certain kinds of medical expenses and so on. But it also comes up, but these are also tied up in the fact that the enshrined, principles of self-reliance and also family reliance, which again, you did point out. So those kinds of welfare principles of self-reliance and of family responsibility is a moral choice, but also it becomes a moral dictate, as enshrined through what you can and cannot do with CPF funds. And that is very different from a kind of collective responsibility to society, right? In terms of thinking about a different way of welfare provision, which I guess that's what you were trying to tease out as well, in terms of how CPF then limits, right, kind of a political imagination about what can or cannot be done in terms of how we address the issue of welfare and inequalities in Singapore. So I think I'm going to stop there for now. And thank you so much, Eve, for highlighting these very rich dimensions about looking through CPF as a particular institution.
Thanks, Karen.
All right. So we actually have a question from your co-author and supervisor, Professor Joe Greener. So I'd invite Professor Greener to unmute and ask your question, please. If that's possible to do.
Okay, yeah, I've unmuted, but I can't seem to start my video. It doesn't matter. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to see the ideas unfold over the last years, Eve, and it's looking really good. So I think that's really exciting and really nice to hear the presentation today. One thing I would ask is, if, obviously Bob Jessop's usually seen to be kind of like a neo-Marxian scholar. Most people would agree with that. Okay. I think my video's on now. And I guess one of the central kind of components of a kind of more Marxist approach to things is the idea of kind of class struggle, or at least kind of class dynamics. So how CPF fits into consolidating consensus around the middle class, or also what kinds of classes in the Singapore context lose out as a result of CPF. So I guess there's a kind of question there about class struggle and how you're interpreting that in this project. And also, secondly, I would say, in order to be sort of critical about CPF in some ways, or to push that critique further, I guess, what's the real kind of violence or injustice here? So what's the, if this is not just sort of middle class people complaining about, if this is not just a problem for the middle class, they've got this financialized subjectivity, well, that's kind of tough for them in a way. But I'm just sort of imagining what a lot of people would come back and sort of say, well, what's the problem here really? Like, what is actually the problem with, facilitating middle classes to save money? Is it really a problem? Because obviously as well, if we compare the standards of living in Singapore of many people who benefit from the CPF, it's pretty minimal. It's pretty good compared to a lot of welfare systems in terms of what it provides. And CPF Life may even turn out to be a pretty solid policy. It's yet to be proved one way or the other, I think, but it may. I mean, the government at least recognised that CPF was not necessarily facilitating good standards of living in later life, and that's why CPF Life was brought in. But I guess I just push a little bit on that kind of what's the injustice of CPF, or how would you really articulate that, and especially in terms of class struggle? And I mean, something I was saying to you a few weeks ago as well was, is the example of neoliberalism in welfare in some senses more directly felt around domestic workers? Obviously, we know that the government's basically institutionalized a system of extreme low wages, abuse, and exploitation for an entire class of global South workers. And in a sense, and also it's absolutely central to the welfare state here. So in a sense, I can see the class struggle there really, really obviously, in a sense. But I guess, yeah, that's the two questions, I guess. So one is sort of like, what's the injustice? And the other one would be the class struggle dynamics in a way.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, it does. Thanks. So I'm just gonna quite briefly talk about so CPF, it doesn't affect everybody evenly, right? It's not an even process. It affects different subjects, different financial subjects very differently, because for example, like I didn't really mention it, but for low wage workers, they usually don't conceptualize CPF in that kind of financialized way, because they don't have the ability to do so. They don't have the financial capacity to kind of like breach into access that kind of market. So in that sense, I think CPF in that sense is really focused on a specific class, and it reproduces that kind of specific class. So in that sense, the injustice of CPF, I would kind of think of it as a way in terms of how the professional managerial class is kind of conceptualized, and how CPF then really garners consent and kind of consent from the professional managerial class in terms of kind of like they like the system, so they want to reproduce the system, and there are the various kind of values and practices that's kind of replicated through CPF because of the kind of like approval that they have been garnered from the professional managerial class. So in this sense, CPF is definitely something that I would argue is very reproductive of class relations. But I think when thinking about class struggle and class dynamics, I think it's quite important to stress that the CPF itself, it's really focused on citizens and for permanent residents, right? So not everybody in Singapore would have access to this welfare tool or welfare policy. So when we're thinking about, I think that's definitely one way to think about CPF when we look at who loses out, right? It's the migrant workers, the low-wage migrant workers who loses out, as well as the very low-wage workers in Singapore who loses out. Because even if we think about the kind of like subsidies that's introduced, like ComCare or the progressive wage model, right? These are highly dependent on the individual to remain employed, that they have to go to skill and training, upskilling session to ensure that they can gain access to additional funds. But even then, like we've seen, right, the access to the funds is maybe just a couple $100s a month, which is not really sufficient to address, the kind of like inflation that we have now nowadays. So, yeah, I think CPF, when talking about CPF, I'm sort of looking at as a tool in terms of how we kind of consolidate hegemony for neoliberalism, right? How we garners support and garners consensus because through the middle class, because it's sort of this wealth growing policy tool. But in this sense, it's I guess it's then very unequal because it excludes excludes a whole population of people, right? The people who are working in Singapore but do not have access to this welfare tool. So in that sense, I know I don't really focus on it too much today, right? But I think we also have to talk about financialization as a way that extracts capital from the global south into global north, right? I would consider Singapore as part of global north, right? Because it really facilitates a kind of like wealth transference into countries like the US and the UK. So Singapore is a finance kind of hub and trading space for this kind of like wealth extraction away from, you know, very poor countries. And this is why there's such growing inequality when we're talking about financialization and the problems of financialization. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, Karen, you had something to say?
Yeah, I thought if it's possible, I just wanted to add on a little bit to you know, this issue about the class consciousness and class dimension, and the ways in which lower wage workers, lower wage Singaporeans, lower wage workers are definitely, you know, very unevenly folded right into this institution. But I thought I would also point out that there's also a gender dimension to this as well, right? That particularly if you think about women workers, especially the older generation, older groups of women workers for whom their participation in the workforce has been much more limited, and therefore they would have had very little, if any, right, input into the CPF retirement account, which then of course severely impacts their ability to rely on that for their own retirement needs, which then make them much more dependent on partners, on family, on children, right, for financial security in later life. So there's that heavily gendered dimension as well in terms of whether it actually represents, right, financial security or actually insecurity in the future.
Yeah, definitely, I agree with that as well.
Okay, I'm gonna pile on here just a little bit, because I think we've talked about the gender dimension. We talked about the middle class and also you know, low wage workers and also migrants. But I think what strikes me is that the CPF system, also if you depict it very well, it has a very strong disciplining effect. All right, if you are low or middle, sort of middle income, but it doesn't have that same sort of restriction if you're high income. And in Singapore, as you pointed out, with increased income and wealth disparity, you have, you know, a hyper wealthy sort of class that is getting citizenship that doesn't seem bound by the CPF, and they also have a lot more access to political power. And that sort of political conservatism, if you will, may not apply as much to them. I mean, they may sort of, you know, be in a stronger position to push for their own agendas, whatever that may be, that could, I think, turn into a sort of political, the wealth inequality becomes a political one, right? That you have a group of people who have far more voice, who are far less constrained by state mechanisms. So I'm wondering if, you know, how you would play that out, because I mean, your sort of description focused on one part of the segment, but with the disparity, there's this other segment that, you know, it doesn't seem to touch. The CPF system doesn't seem to touch very much.
Yeah, definitely. So I think I sort of look at CPF as a way, as a kind of like introduction for understanding financialization in Singapore, because this is kind of like the first contact that a lot of Singaporeans would have when they think about financialization, because they have to think about like, oh, how do I maximize my monies in the ordinary account, or how do I maximize money in special account, things like that. But you're definitely right, because CPF, they also have a cap in terms of how much money goes into the monthly deduction, right? There's a cap of up to $6,000, but I think this is going to be slowly increased to $8,000 in 2025, I think. But yeah, so I don't think like I have a way to kind of like I don't disagree with that statement, right? In terms like the hyper wealthy, they actually do have a lot more power in terms of like dictating political and economic agendas. But I think this is a wider problem in terms of understanding, for example, like billionaires and their role in terms of like dictating economic decisions. You know, whether they decide to open a factory in certain parts of the country or things like that. Yeah, I don't really know how to actually address this, but I think you're definitely right. We have to understand that CPF is just kind of one sector in understanding how financialization unfolds on certain sections of the population. But I think more importantly is that I do want to address that financialization itself is quite a problem, because it's basically how the wealthy actually hoards the wealth, right? So there's no kind of circulation of the capital back into the economy. there's no kind of trickle-down economics either. So I think that's a very key problem with financialization and how it really empowers the hyper-wealthy to continue enabling their own agendas.
Right. I just also want to add that the way that you've been describing what's going on, the sort of socializing effect would apply to people growing up in Singapore, but we also have people who, because of their wealth, are naturalizing as looking at Singapore as a place to hide their wealth, right? So in that sense, there's no socialization or very little socialization, less disciplining, and so you have this sort of imbalance of power and the sort of lack of disciplining, which could in future, drive the system out of whack in a way, or at least potentially open the pathway for that. That's sort of occurred to me as you describe things. Oh, okay. So I see a hand up here. Yes. Lina Rathel, please. Why don't you chime in?
Hi. I very, very much enjoyed the presentation. I thought it was really wonderful. Questions coming a little bit from the side, so because very nicely, I thought about. Sorry,
sorry, I can't quite hear you. You're breaking in and out.
Yes, yeah. So I thought it was a wonderful presentation. So you talked about this kind of like role of the state in promoting financialization and like kind of individual financialized habits as a form of welfare or quasi-welfare. So I was wondering, I mean, you talk about a very specific context, the Singaporean context, which is kind of, I think, quite a particular and peculiar context. I was wondering if similar dynamics are happening, like what about your project is so specific to Singapore, and what kind of applies more broadly in terms of the role of the state in promoting individual financialized habits? So that is my first question. And my second question is, so I'm quite interested in Islamic finance as a route towards financialization, but also kind of somewhat different normative framework for finance. And I was wondering if there's also a kind of, I mean, you talked very nicely, I thought, about this professional managerial class that is being targeted in those, through those policies. But I was wondering if there's also a kind of like, kind of racialized element to that perhaps as well. And I'm just thinking about it. I had a PhD student a while back, and he was working on the kind of CPF nominations. And so that is difficult to kind of make it compatible with Islamic inheritance law. And so this was something where CPF was not necessarily catering to all the kind of cultural needs of all Singaporean citizens. So I was wondering if similar dynamics are playing out in fostering those kind of speculative tendencies ultimately. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so whether or not this my study has other applications in other countries, I think when looking at financialization, there are sort of like similar patterns or processes, I guess, but they don't occur uniformly. This is not necessarily something that can happen in one way and replicated or even modeled after in other countries, because there is historical contingencies, cultural factors, and even the model of the state that really kind of like imposes differences between how financialization is sort of like how it unfolds. But I think when thinking about financialization, one of the interesting pattern that we can see is definitely increasingly countries are kind of like they are relying on like the financialization of pension funds. So the financialization of pension funds actually basically Kale Belford actually wrote about this. He described how financialization of the pension funds is one of the biggest ways that the financial economy is growing, is because it's such a big amount of money. I think different countries have different practices that would affect different subject behavior. I can't really speak too much to that, but I think practices like that we see with 401k in the US, they actually highlight the problem of privatized pension organization, I guess, like when these are kind of like attached to like more, I guess, retail, privatized retail bank rather than, for example, like state managed, there's a risk that pensioners will actually lose money. It's in that sense, like because the financial markets is actually quite unregulated. So there's ways in which people do not actually get the promise that has been made to them, right? When they are talking about, how much returns they can make. So what may end up happening is that they will actually end up losing money, or the 401k actually ends up being quite an unreliable system in the US. To address the racialized elements in CPF, I think that's definitely the case. So I think like Singapore is kind of known for this kind of like multiracial country where we have the the CMIO model, the Chinese, Indian, Malay, and others population. But historically, the Malay population, they are one of the lower earning income groups. So in that sense, CPF would then, because it's tagged to your income's percentage of your income, so then historically they would also have much lower amount of savings in CPF as well. Sorry, I wasn't able to catch the last questions on the inheritance. So I was wondering, could you repeat that question?
That was just an example of other areas of CPF where it wasn't always operating so smoothly in a multi-ethnic context.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, I mean, your point good. So it's kind of intersection, isn't it, of class and race, basically, in terms of how CPF is experienced by different parts of the Singapore population.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
No problem. I think I just want to make a point as well. I think like with CPF, there's actually a government site called like Factually. So it's basically where like the government sort of make clarifications on like myths and miscommunications on either CPF policy. Like when people believe that the CPF money is mismanaged by the government, or they believe that if they die and they don't make CPF nomination, then the money is taken by the government. They make a lot of clarifications like this. So I think that's one way like the state kind of try to like smoothen out the process. I don't know how successful it is, because with technologies, the people who are usually misinformed, there might be some groups of the population that may have less access to this kind of like websites and things like that. So yeah.
All right. So we have a question also from Philip Holden, who asked, thanks you for your wonderful talk, and asked, following from the responses about class and gender. He's curious about how, from a historical perspective, on the CPF might supplement your account of subjectification. So Philip says, the CPF was actually introduced under David Marshall in 1955. This is the Labour Front government, and was campaigned against by the PAP. This is what Philip remembers. And so do this and other historical changes plot a way in which earlier socialist subjectivities fostered in the developmental state and are somehow folded into this sort of and subsumed by neoliberalism? So this is Philip says this is someone who's been paying the CPF for years, and so he has seen a lot of changes. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the CPF was actually introduced under the colonialist like government, right? So it was campaigned against because like I think the British state wasn't that interested in producing a really good kind of pension design for Singaporeans at that point of time. But I think with the changes and all the different things, I think housing is also something that has been kind of like neoliberalized in Singapore, right? So housing is quite a debated subject recently in Singapore, mainly because of like, we have a very interesting public housing system here, right? So even though it's sort of like considered public housing in that sense, it's very heavily subsidized by the state. But it's actually in a kind of like semi-public market, right? So the housing prices are dictated by market demands. They're not actually state controlled. There's no regulations in that. So the public housing is at once something that's supposed to generate housing security, but also something that's supposed to be an asset, like it's supposed to increase in price. And this is something that the PAP has kind of depended their legitimacy on, right? I think Chopping Huat has been really substantial in kind of talking about housing as a legitimacy project for the PAP. But I think it has definitely been neoliberalized because of how housing markets have been working. While it's definitely limited to the sense because it's only open to Singaporeans and Singapore permanent residents, I still think that the way that housing has sort of been structured is definitely meets into the patterns of neoliberalism, because like everybody wants their housing prices to increase, right? Nobody wants it to drop. Nobody wants it to be universal in that sense, universalized. This was a policy that was introduced by, I think, Singapore Democratic Party. It was incredibly unpopular. Nobody wanted that. But yeah, so I still think housing is probably even though public housing, which started with a very socialist kind of tendency, it has definitely become something that is quite neoliberal in tendency. Thank you for the question.
All right, so we've got one more question from Nessa Swin, whose thesis is concerned with insurance and real estate agents and how an important function of your work is to supplement the processes of subjectification that you talk about by bridging ordinary Singaporeans into financial and asset participation. So in the emphasis they place on the support they provide to clients who don't have the time or bandwidth to learn how best to optimize instruments like the CPF, Nessa says she is made to think about the failures of such technologies of government. Would you have anything to comment about how these may not work as smoothly as intended?
I think within financial markets or for financial sellers, there is a deliberate intention to kind of provide smokes and mirrors when we're talking about financial products. There's this deliberate way in which because you don't understand it, right? So in that sense, we are disempowered. We're not really enlightened to do our own financial planning. We have to rely on external forces or getting somebody else to do that. And I think that's really part of the process in terms of providing this illusion of growth, and why people tend to buy into financial products or buy into the stock markets and things like that. But I definitely want to stress that we have to remember that the financialization is very much speculative. It's always based on speculation, rising interest rates and things like that. So it's not something that should actually be such a huge part of the current economy, because it really doesn't address any real kind of economic productivity goals, right? It doesn't have anything to do with increasing real levels of wages, and it doesn't actually addresses I guess, social redistribution in a very meaningful sense. So I think in that sense, I would try to problematize financialization like that. But I think that's just a comment. I don't really have an answer to that question. Yeah.
Okay. I guess this brings us more towards time. Karen does have a comment. Karen, would you like to comment, and then I can bring things to a close?
Okay, yeah, I was just trying to fill in the chat that the fact that CPF investment scheme component, for instance, right, as well as the wider push, if you look at programs like Money Sense, which is run by the MAS, encouraging people towards investing rather than just saving, is indeed part of a wider kind of strategic objective, right, to foster financial center development, which includes developing the insurance industry, growing the insurance industry, and the wealth management and investment industry as well. So by giving people more and more choice, it is actually also in order to create, right, kind of a growing demand and growing market growth for the finance industry. So it's very much tied in, right, together with linking individual financial subject aspirations and growing the financial center aspirations for Singapore and for economic development.
All right. Thank you, Karen. Any last words, Eve, before we end off?
Yeah, so I think I just want to call, let's repoliticize welfare again. Let's try to think about ways in which we can think about, how can we try to improve social redistribution in Singapore. So yeah, thanks everyone for spending, this Tuesday evening or afternoon with me. And I hope you enjoyed the seminar. But if you have any questions, you can email me. But yeah, so yeah, great. Thanks everyone.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon in the UK. We're really glad you could make it. Please stay tuned for our subsequent seminars. We will be rolling out a few more junior scholar seminars, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you very much for your attention and for spending your time with us. Have a good evening or good afternoon. So well.